Welcome back, APUSH students. Today is chapter 16 of the American Pageant, titled The South and Slavery Controversy. If you don't have the American Pageant, it's fine because the content is still going to be the same. I'm going to be going over all the key terms and notes for this chapter that helped me get a 5, so I encourage you to take notes along as well. Cotton is king, the reliance from other regions on the South's cotton. The South thought that because nations like Britain and regions like the North relied on their cotton manufacturing, if war ever broke out over the issue of slavery, then the South would have the advantage. Cotton gave the South power. West African Squadron, part of the Royal Navy. They captured slave ships and freed slaves, a symbol of the growing fervor for international human rights developing in Britain, but not the rest of the Americas. So some of the more civil rights pertaining to slavery had developed over in Europe, but not necessarily in America yet. Breakers, people meant to discipline slaves. These were brutal people. It is an example of the vicious and cruel tactics to make sure slaves remained subordinate to their masters, masters repelling any attempt of slaves to higher their status or dignity. So as much as these breakers were physically attacking the slaves, the psychological effect was even more daunting. The Black Belt region on the southwest frontier, it was home to the majority of slaves and the most prosperous cotton-producing plantations. Life was warm and rough, and it transferred onto the backs of slaves. So cotton could thrive the most in these warmer temperatures, and of course the slaves were the ones doing the work, not the masters. Responsorial style of African American religious preaching. It is an example of slaves combining their African heritage and Christianity and other American aspects to create a unique African American culture. At some point, either on an essay or a short answer, you'll have to compare the brutality of slavery versus how slaves were able to keep their dignity and culture, and this is big evidence for that. Nat Turner's Rebellion, slave rebellion in Virginia with bloodshed. The violence exemplified by the slaves killing many whites in Virginia became a leading example that the issue of slavery will be solved by violence over diplomacy. This principle that was basically said that it was inevitable that there'd be violence over the issue of slavery is the most obviously built upon in the Bleeding Kansas, which is later on. Amistad, Spanish ship where slaves revolted and captured it. They were freed by the North, showing a rare success of slaves fighting for their freedom. So obviously there are many horror stories about slaves trying to lead rebellions, but this was one of the rare good ones. American Colonization Society, Society for Transporting Slaves Back to Africa. This partial solution to the slavery issue revealed the inherent racism and superiority whites felt against blacks. Also, the slave resistance to the idea of being transported revealed their distinct cultural aspects tied to America. So the slaves actually resisted a lot of ideas about sending them back to Africa and giving them their sovereignty back in Africa, because after a while in America they began naturally to feel tied to it, even though it wasn't a good place for them. Liberia, West African colony for freed slaves. It was a faraway, strange land, and slaves going there would have to leave behind their African American culture. So this is just another example of where slaves could go to leave America, but they didn't really want to leave. Theodore Weld, abolitionist evangelist. He taught to many farmers in the North about why slavery was sinful and bad. He became a leading religious spirit for abolitionism. So the cause of abolitionism was closely tied with more progressive religious ideas. Tappins, wealthy merchants who preached abolitionism. They traveled along the ill-educated Northwest and advocated against slavery. They assembled a team consisting of famous beachers who were inspired to create more anti-slavery propaganda. The Liberator, newspaper against slavery. The radical and sometimes violent nature of the paper's opposition against slavery caused it to be known as the opening shots of the Civil War. So as always, as soon as issues get to the media, they become extremely polarizing. William Lloyd Garrison, passionate anti-slavery activist. His aggressive, outspoken words against slavery made the issue of slavery more about the uprooting of evil and cruelty. So this tied slavery to a broader context about trying to restore morality in society. American Anti-Slavery Society, a foundation of people against slavery. Their strict principles against slavery and the South inspired more people to join in union against slavery. Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, written by a black man trying to inspire more black abolitionists. So this is one of your earlier examples of other African Americans fighting for abolitionism rather than white people. He not only advocated for the release of slaves, but also the end of racism and white supremacy. He promoted violence in the form of a black revolt, yet another example of violence becoming a leading answer. Frederick Douglass, most prominent black abolitionism. This is a name you will definitely have to know. He resisted white oppression and continued to preach for abolition. He was able to write a successful autobiography that gave further insight to the struggling life of a slave and an abolitionist. Sojourner Truth, black woman who was an abolitionist. She helped to link the cause of black emancipation and women's rights. Linking multiple causes helps to expand the movement. So abolitionism definitely coincided with women's rights, and this helped to get more people to join the movement. It's also important not to underestimate the impact of women in any movement because they're often seen as the moral side of humankind. Liberty Party, political party focused on abolition. It garnered a lot of support from abolitionists. It is a leading example of how the issue of slavery established itself more at the forefront of American politics. So as most major issues in America, they eventually worked their way into the political scene. Mason-Dixon line separating the South and the North. Under that line, almost all anti-slavery supporters were met with harsh backlash from the people and, more importantly, the legislature, who made it impossible to support emancipation. Gag resolution, action to not act on anti-slavery petitions. It is an example of the federal government not wanting to deal with the issue of emancipation and an example of free speech being taken away. It was a major step back for the abolitionist cause. So essentially the government passed that talking about slavery, preaching abolitionism, they just don't want to act on anything slavery related in the legislature, and this basically completely paused the movement because they didn't want to deal with it, and it's just not a very good solution for a polarizing issue. Elijah P. Lovejoy, Reverend in Illinois and anti-slavery activist. He was killed by an anti-abolitionist group. His death became a symbol for other abolitionists against the cruelty of the people who fight to uphold slavery. Although he's not the most famous name in the abolitionist movement, it is fair to call him a martyr. And that's a wrap. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next chapter, and goodbye.